Well, welcome everybody to today's continuing episode with Joseph Lawal. Did I say it right this time?
Yeah,
Lawal?
that's right.
Okay, I'm trying. You say it once for all of us just so that we know.
Joseph Lawal.
Got it. All right. So that is how you say Joseph's last name. I'm just going by Joseph. So, all right. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about philosophy and, the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And specifically some of the philosophical concepts related to Joseph Smith and his contributions to that. But before we get into that, I think that it might be good for us to just talk for a minute about, what philosophy is and why you think it should matter to a Latter-day Saint.
Yeah, so lots of different people will give lots of different answers as to what philosophy is. I think it's best to think of it as kind of a cluster of topics or questions, and you might say interested in the kind of the fundamental nature of reality, but really, I think it's easiest to break it up into the kind of five major categories traditionally that philosophy's been broken up into. So there's logic, right? Just the kind of rules for thinking, but also a little bit more than that, right? I mean, that's controversial in and of itself, right? But yeah, so logic, right? The laws of logic, formal logic, informal logic, fallacies, all that stuff is an area of philosophy. And then epistemology, which is the study of truth and knowledge and justification, right? How do we know? What do we know? What does it mean for something to be true? That sort of thing. Metaphysics, which is concerned with the nature of reality, right? So what exists? What's the nature of what exists? Those sorts of questions. Aesthetics, which is beauty, essentially, right? What does it mean for something to be beautiful? Those sorts of questions. Art, it's that's again quite broad. And then ethics, right? What is the right thing to do? How do we know it, right? What determines what's the right thing to do? Those sorts of questions.
Well, it sounds like those are all things that are very much related to the questions that we in the church are talking about and trying to answer.
Absolutely. And that's why I think philosophy ought to be something that a lot more saints interact with, at least. I mean, not everyone ought to be a philosopher in the professional sense, right? Obviously. But yeah, we are answering philosophical questions when we endorse doctrines in the church. And so the more self-consciously we can do that, and the more aware we are of kind of how other people answer those questions, the better we can be aware of what kind of our positions mean, like what they entail and what they involve, and how other people are going to be perceiving that, right? We have a radically different worldview than many of our Christian contemporaries, right? And understanding that is going to be really important for understanding why so many people really balk at some of our doctrines, right?
Yeah.
So there's definitely a practical benefit to understanding philosophy as a member of the church. In addition to all that, it's just a lot of fun and it can be edifying in various other ways. But it can be very practical to be aware of why other Christians will find our doctrines so bizarre. Right?
And that's actually a really good point. Understanding other people. When you understand philosophy, you kind of get why people come to the conclusions that they do.
Yeah.
Because people can do things that seem totally off the wall, but once you understand some of the philosophy behind it, you realize, at least for me, I go, okay, they have this one fundamental difference in the way that they view the world, and that leads them down an entirely different path, logically, than I would go down, right?
And it can be rational, right? People we fundamentally disagree with can have these really rational, coherent systems based on maybe a couple of assumptions that are very different than ours at a very basic level, right? And it can be very hard to see that it's rational until you realize, we just have very different starting points, right?
Yep. And I found when I engage with people, a lot of times it isn't, I a lot of times have the goal not so much of necessarily convincing them that I'm right, though I do that sometimes too, but in a real serious conversation, what I usually try and do is I'm trying to understand the nature of our disagreement so that I can figure out, okay, where is the disconnect here? Because you seem totally crazy to me, but once you figure out where that fundamental disconnect is, all of a sudden it's like, okay, you're not crazy. You're not a bad person. You just are mistaken. And if I had made that same mistake, I probably would have ended up going down the same path that you did.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's, I think, one of the really, really helpful things about kind of being a little bit more philosophically literate and self-aware is that it helps in identifying that, I think. Yeah, you're right.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into Joseph Smith here a little bit, because he definitely had, it's funny, Joseph was not a philosopher by any stretch of the imagination, but he had philosophical positions which he brought out, not through philosophical rational argument per se, though he did some of that. It was more just, this is the way that things really are through sort of revelation, but they had really interesting philosophical implications. And you talked a lot about this on your YouTube video. And so I wanted to kind of go through some of those points and discuss some of them. And we'll start off kind of with, Joseph's conception on sort of, if we ask the question, what is the nature of the universe, and look at the way Joseph kind of viewed that, and then how sort of the traditional conceptions of what is the nature of the universe. If you could speak to that, let's hear about it.
Yeah, so it's a little bit controversial. I think most kind of at least semi-academic members of the church will say that Joseph Smith was a materialist, right? So to say that the nature of the universe is fundamentally material, right? So that in a kind of Cartesian sense of the term substance, right? So substance is as kind of the kinds of ways things can be, right? Where Descartes held, that he was a dualist, so he held that there were material things and then there were like spiritual things, right? Or mind, right? So these two separate substances, they're two different types of things, and everything's either made up of mind or made up of material things, with the exception of God on Descartes' view. And so Joseph Smith, I think traditionally has been understood to be a materialist, where he rejects that there's a separate substance that's spirit, right? And so like Sam Brown, I think he doesn't think Joseph Smith was a materialist. I guess I'm not entirely sure, but he doesn't think Latter-day Saints ought to be materialists. And I think Blake Ostler, I think he's a dualist, actually. So there are a couple of places where it seems to me pretty clear that Joseph Smith was a materialist. So for instance, one of the places is in the Times and Seasons editorial, Try the Spirits. But then we also have a canonized instance of this philosophical statement in D&C 31, where he says, this is recorded by William Clayton, but it was Joseph Smith speaking to a Methodist preacher. There's no such thing as immaterial matter. All spirit is matter, but it's more fine or pure and can only be discerned by purer eyes. We cannot see it, but when our bodies are purified, we shall see that it's all matter. So, fairly straightforward. That seems like materialism. And Joseph's contemporaries, like Orson and Parley Pratt, were very clearly materialists, and they had conversed with the prophet on this, right?
And so I just a clarification for the listeners. So when you're saying dualism, the idea here is that there is the material world, and then there's some sort of an immaterial world, some sort of the whatever that is. But what Joseph Smith is no, there's no such thing as immaterial material, right? It's everything is ultimately stuff. In that sense. So, and that kind of a term that's used for that, if I'm not mistaken, is monism, right? It's the idea that mon from one, mono, versus dualism, which is two. So instead of there being two kind of levels to reality, one material, one immaterial, Joseph Smith's conception was that everything was material, in some sense. Is that a fair representation of that?
Yeah. So yeah, maybe it's a little bit misleading to say like the material world and the physical world. I mean, that's right. But when with someone like Descartes, he does think they're interacting and working together, right? Where human beings are made up of both matter and mind, right? So we have a material element, which means we're extended, right? We take up space. And then there's the thinking part of us, right? And so he thought, on various, like on conceivability grounds, that we could separate them. So they have to be able to be different substances. It's something that inherently thinks and something that inherently is extended. And so, yeah, that's a dualistic picture. Descartes' kind of the paradigm dualist. And then you have the monist pictures, and you could be a materialist or you could be an idealist, right? Where you either say matter is all there is or mind is all there is, right? So like Bishop Berkeley was the famous idealist, where he says just everything is mind, nothing is matter, there's no such thing as matter, right? So that's kind of the other kind of monism.
When you say mind, so, and again, some of these terms, when you get down to it, get a little bit tricky. So is the universe made up of mind, or is it made up of matter? And when we're saying mind, we're thinking of something that's not matter, something more akin to like what we would say maybe with consciousness. Is that sort of fair to say, that there's a body and then there's some sort of a consciousness that's not quote unquote material? Is that fair? Or how do you?
Well, yeah. So it's tricky. So on a dualist picture, yeah. So something like what the layman means by consciousness or intelligence or mind, so spirit, something like that, is what's being talked about. When philosophers say consciousness, they tend to mean it in a technical sense, and it's like what it's like to be someone. It's a much narrower concept. But yes, so like consciousness or just kind of the thinking, the capacity for thinking is meant to, in Descartes, is meant to be some different substance than what is extended. And yeah, so if you're a monist who's an idealist, you think everything is mind, which is, you know, a very difficult, weird concept if you're not kind of steeped in philosophy, and you kind of forget that these things they can seem really weird. That is, it's a very, very strange view initially, right? And Berkeley had particular, especially theological reasons for accepting that, right? But I think it's easier for people to understand materialism, particularly because it's I think the prevailing scientific view today. I think probably most scientists are like quite reductive materialists, right?
So again, to kind of recap here, so you have monism, everything is material. You have dualism, you have mind and material, and then you have idealism, which is saying that fundamentally mind is everything.
And that would be another kind of monism, right? Because it's just one substance. So you could be a materialist monist, or you can be an idealist monist, right? Or you can be a dualist.
I see. Okay, I got it. Okay, very cool. So as far as Joseph Smith's, and it seems that Joseph Smith is talking about monism, but I do have a question about this sort of material, everything is material, right? Because it comes down to a bit of a question when I've looked at this of, I don't think when Joseph talked about material, he was talking about the same things that when Richard Dawkins talks about material, what he's talking about. There's a fundamental, like Joseph saying, yeah, everything is material, but what is the distinction, I guess, between sort of Joseph's notion of material versus sort of a traditional, nowadays your average materialist like Richard Dawkins?
Yeah, so one big difference is that Joseph had a sort of stratified monism. So he talks about there being ordinary matter and then this spirit matter that's more fine or pure, right? And that's certainly not something that's particularly part of like a contemporary scientific view of what it is to, for matter to be out there. So that's one big difference. But as well, I think materialist pictures have tended to be, I mean, this is not universal, but they've tended to be kind of reductive, and I mean, nihilistic is a very loaded word, but they'll deny often like free will, for instance, right? So Joseph Priestley and Erasmus Darwin were two big materialists just before Joseph Smith's day. And yeah, like Joseph Priestley was a necessitarian, right? Everything is going to happen the way it's going to happen because there's no free will, because everything is material, right? So like Orson Pratt, when he was in England in 1839 or something, I think there was an English priest who writes, oh, the Mormons are just like Joseph Priestley. They've got all these problems to their view because they're determinists and all this sort of thing. And yeah, so one of the nice things I think about the Latter-day Saint view, as it begins with Joseph Smith, is that it's kind of a synthesis where you get an appealing view from kind of a scientific standpoint, because you get the materialism, everything is ultimately matter, but you also maintain some of the very nice things about Christianity, or the way it's tended to be in Christianity. So like a libertarian view of free will, right? Where we kind of have genuine, strong free will. You get, we want to include in this worldview a strong sense of what it means for morality to be out there. You get God and all these things, right? So I like
a reductive materialism, kind of the way that, and the reason people come to this conclusion is one of the, if you take a Richard Dawkins approach, where we're basically just atoms floating around in the universe and that's just all there is. Well, atoms they behave according to the laws of nature.
Right.
And so if that's all you are, then you are just dancing, as he said, dancing to the music of your DNA. You don't make choices. You are just a meat robot.
It's all neurons firing or chemicals in the brain, right? It's all these
just like
biological processes, which are chemical, which are physical, and it's all just it's just matter moving, right?
Yeah. Which it's funny, right before I got on this podcast, I was discussing with someone, one of the big problems with that is I don't understand how you have rationality, the ability to choose between the rational and the irrational, unless if you're just matter in motion, but obviously that's a separate thing. We could go, I'm sure there's lots of, you probably come back on that pretty good with other arguments against that sort of view. But it does seem to be from reductive materialism that determinism is the logical consequence of that. But because Joseph Smith has this view of material that's refined and more, whatever the heck that means. You know what I mean? I've always, and everyone's like, oh, well, that means it's like smaller. We just don't have microscopes that can see it. I don't think that's what it meant. Maybe even he thought it meant that, but it's there's an idea that there's a level to materiality that we don't understand. And at that level of materiality exists sort of this notion of intelligence or spirit matter. And I don't know, do you want to, any more thoughts on that, or want to talk a little bit about that? Or
yeah, I think you're right that it's quite natural if you're a materialist to go the kind of very reductive determinist route. So it was certainly unusual in Joseph Smith's day to be a materialist and to have these views of kind of a strong view of free will and morality, that sort of thing. I think it's less unusual today, but it's still unusual. I think most scientifically minded people are materialists, and most materialists in turn are reductive in many ways, right? Most philosophers, and I would imagine most scientists, are compatibilists about free will, right? Determinism is true, and somehow we still have free will, that sort of thing. I think we're still in a minority position in being materialists and kind of taking a robustly realist view about many of these sorts of things that we do, like free will and morality.
So when Joseph talks about, and again, so I'm going to try and paint his picture. So in his picture, fundamentally everything is material, but the nature of material is far broader than a Richard Dawkins, right? Mm-hmm. There's this level of materiality at which intelligence or spirit matter exists. And could you go over a little bit about maybe Joseph's view of this idea of intelligence or spirit matter? And there were some things in your video that you talked about in regards to that.
So there's not a lot from Joseph Smith. We get a lot more with Orson Pratt, who works out this really complicated but neat, very cool system. I think it's really, really fun the way he handles it. Where he has these kind of self-moving, intelligent particles that kind of constitute the laws of nature, or they drive the laws of nature, that sort of thing. But for Joseph Smith, it's. I mean, he, like you said, he wasn't a philosopher, although he had some very philosophical things to say. He does have this view. For instance, in D&C 9330, he says all intelligence is independent in that sphere in which God has placed it to act for itself. Otherwise, there's no existence. Which is really, that last phrase, "otherwise there's no existence," is really curious. I'm not sure what to make of it.
That is a philosopher will take that scripture and go, "Whoa, there's a lot there."
Seriously, yeah. So this idea that this intelligences, which are somehow founded in or the same thing as matter, are independent in the sphere in which God has placed it, has been interpreted, from very early on, from the very beginning, to mean free, right? So you have these intelligences made up of matter somehow that can make decisions, and Joseph Smith's view of the way it works with God. You have this in the King Thought discourse. God, who's a more advanced intelligence, finds himself in the midst of these other intelligences and thinks, oh, well, I know the rules for advancement. I can show you, given these kind of laws in the universe. And I think for Joseph Smith, they're just kind of brute in some way, right? I mean, not in the technical sense. They could be necessary, but they're just out there. I read Joseph Smith as saying they're not dependent on God, mm-hmm. Which is not, I think, later thinkers have tended to try to say that they are dependent on God in some way. So these rules are there, and so by certain operations, mental, physical operations, we can have advancement, right? So Truman Madsen says there are like 4 defining features of Joseph Smith's view of intelligence: autonomous, free, they have a capacity for improvement, and intelligent. I think those are the 4 things he attributes to this view, and I think that's right. That's the kind of basic picture, is that there are these individual autonomous intelligences that can advance themselves, but they're ultimately material, and that's kind of the very at the foundation of what the universe is like. I think that's the picture for Joseph.
I see. So real quick, it's funny. One of the atheist thinkers that has influenced me a lot has been Sam Harris. I think Sam Harris is a very interesting atheist. I've read some of his books. He obviously is one who wrote very famously that free will is an illusion, which I obviously take some issues there. But one thing that he has hinted at, I don't know that he's a believer in this, is this notion of panpsychism. So one of the great problems in philosophy is the hard problem of consciousness, the whole idea of how in the heck are we having if you take 2 atoms, there's no consciousness there. But all of a sudden, if you get a whole bunch of atoms together into a human being, all of a sudden you have consciousness. Like, how did that happen? And there's this idea out there of panpsychism. Do you want to give a little bit of an explanation of what panpsychism is And then if you think there's any correlation between the idea of panpsychism and this idea of sort of independent intelligences within matter itself.
So there are different ways of approaching this question of where consciousness comes from. So you could say that it's this separate substance, right? So maybe God gives us a body and then he puts a mind in there, and this mind is just this different substance, right? You could say it's emergent. So certain combinations of atoms will eventually give rise to, in like a non-linear fashion, consciousness, this ability for, you know, self-reflection and all these things, and this like phenomenal character of our experience, right? And then, you know, kind of another alternative is this panpsychism view. And I think it's quite natural on the picture that Joseph Smith paints to like something like panpsychism. So you look at it, you say, oh, well, you've got this matter that's out there, and if you want to say that intelligence is eternal, right? So which it looks like Joseph Smith is saying, where it's like God finds himself amidst these intelligences. You know, you don't want to say that there's something else imposing a separate substance onto matter and giving it mind, right? I mean, obviously, initially we've already ruled out dualism, I think, on this picture, right? But there's nothing like prior with a mind that can be kind of working this, and similarly, there's nothing that could be combining atoms such that emergentism would be the case, right? And it seems unlikely to say that just kind of atoms randomly through motion would end up hitting each other in such a way that arises. This Orson Pratt talks about this, and so it seems natural to say, well, panpsychism. So panpsychism, this view that consciousness is somehow fundamental to reality. It's already there at a fundamental level. Right?
So just so that you're clear, so basically with panpsychism, you're saying is that individual atoms actually do have some sort of consciousness individually. You just like it's on some lower level of consciousness, maybe in the way that a full-grown adult is more conscious than a brand new baby that's barely forming. It's like that consciousness grows as the baby grows. So these atoms do have consciousness, but they're not. It's at like 50 bajillion times lower level than that. Is that it? Just to clarify, that's sort of the panpsychist view.
That's the basic picture. I mean, so there are different ways of cashing it out. You might say something like so electrons, you know, have certain properties like a negative charge, and they have a certain spin. And you might say that maybe like a spin is like a form of consciousness, right? That's one way that you can kind of cash out this panpsychist picture. But then another, right, is to say that, you know, maybe if the universe is made up of fundamental particles, like that's controversial. But if they are, yeah, maybe even fundamental particles have a form of consciousness, right? And so this was like Orson Pratt. He attributes to them a lot of consciousness, a lot of intelligence, right? He says they're like agents, they're like little mini people essentially, and they're basically omniscient for Orson Pratt, right? So yeah, very early on in the church, you get this because it's a very natural way to conclude from what Joseph Smith has said, right? You have these like eternal intelligence as well. It looks like consciousness is just fundamental to reality then, and that's I would say consciousness is fundamental to reality is probably the most concise way I could explain what panpsychism is. So it's it's a very natural view for someone who adopts a kind of Joseph Smith framework to kind of lean toward, I think.
Yeah, because I always find it funny that when you're dealing with Joseph Smith and our theology, a lot of because traditional Catholicism and Orthodox and Protestantism, they're all dualists. And so for us to come out, we're like literally, it's like, wait, you guys are on the atheist side here? You guys are saying that everything's material? Like, obviously that throws up all sorts of issues there. Now, just to change gears a little bit on this, I wanted to talk a little bit about the conception of creation for Joseph Smith compared to the other popular conceptions of creation that are out there. So do you want to go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So Joseph Smith, I think, was fairly radical in his day for denying what's called creation ex nihilo, or creatio, you know, in the Latin, creatio ex nihilo, right? A creation from nothing. So you know, on the classical theist picture, or let's say classical Christian picture, because not all Christians are classical theists, you have this God who's outside space and time, and he brings the universe, matter and mind, into existence at one moment, right? And it's from there was nothing before, and then there's matter and mind, or just matter or just mind, or whatever picture you kind of monist or dualist picture that you adopt with that. And so that has been, I think, the popular conception for a long time. So, there's some disagreement, but it looks very much like the ancient Hebrews did not believe in creation ex nihilo until the time of the Maccabees. Like, you have an unambiguous endorsement of creation ex nihilo in the Apocrypha. But I think, like, my understanding is the consensus is in what we have as the Old Testament, there's nothing like creation ex nihilo. Right?
So that looks to like Joseph is essentially his idea that creation was not out of nothing, but out of pre-existent chaotic material, that actually is more in line with the ancient Hebrew view of things.
Yeah, it's definitely the more ancient view. So ancient Hebrews and also the ancient Greeks, right? So Plato and Aristotle, for instance, both held that this is kind of this, the matter isn't coming into being from nothing, right? And so then it's really, creation ex nihilo is really picked up on by the early church fathers. They're really, and under the influence of Greek thought, not on that particular point, but in the way they approach the world, God has to be this really absolute, the greatest thing, right? In Anselm, the greatest conceivable being, right? That than which none greater can be conceived. And so you can see why very naturally that would lead to saying, well, we don't want God to be in space and time and embodied, right? And we don't want matter to be prior to or just as primeval as God. And so God has to be outside it, and matter has to be kind of come later, right? So you can see why that's quite a natural view. If you want to have this great big God, then you would have creation ex nihilo. And so and this is I think the standard account. Christians will contest this, of course, but is that this creation ex nihilo is really a later development. I mean, early in Christianity, but later if you want to say that Christianity is continuous with this older form of Judaism. So that's the kind of classical Christian view. And then our view is creation ex materia. We have this pre-existent stuff that's already there when God's there, and he makes from that. And then you have the kind of, maybe the second big rival for the Latter-day Saint view would be the atheistic view. And there are different views here. Traditionally, this eternal universe, the past eternal universe where matter has always existed, was the kind of atheist position. And that's our position. Today, I think the scientific view tends to be that the universe comes into existence in some form with the Big Bang, right? So they would say there is a beginning point in time, and that's why initially the Big Bang was really quite a friendly view for Christians. It was initially proposed by a Catholic priest because it looks like, oh, well, you have God, and then God brings it into existence, and it's a scientifically quite a strong model. It looks like it accounts for a lot of the data. But then, in contemporary physics, I'm not an expert on this, but kind of like quantum fields, that sort of thing, they can kind of say, it looks like you have this indeterminacy. Maybe it can just come into being by itself. And so you can get a finite past without needing God, right? And so that's, I think, a standard view is that, matter came into existence, but you don't need God for that. So we are, I think, again, in the minority on this in saying that we have a creation ex materia. Yeah.
So in so just to kind of go over a few of this, and we can see how this really plays havoc on some of the traditional conceptions of God.
Right.
God within a material universe, rather than outside of it. A God who is creating not out of nothing, but organizing essentially the chaos. The analogy I've heard that I think is a really good one, an easy one, is that a painter paints with the paint and creates something, but they didn't bring the paint out of nothing and the canvas out of nothing. They took the existing stuff that was there, the chaos, and they organized it into something beautiful. So that's Joseph's view. And then on top of that, and now here's what's interesting is on a lot of these issues, we fall on the same side as the atheists, but specifically with the Big Bang. Okay, this is one that's interesting to me because the Big Bang, essentially, I like to use the idea of a cone, right? The universe is expanding out. We know that. And if you basically extrapolate that back, everything goes down to a point, like a point that's so small, it's an infinitely small point, basically. And that essentially said, and what happens is I've one wrong conception that's out there, I think, is the idea that, well, there was this little ball and it was really hot and it was just like sitting there for forever. And then it boom, it blew up. It's like, no, that isn't what it was. The Big Bang means literally from a point in space and time, everything just kind of came out of it. And we can't even conceptualize it because none of our laws of physics, anything, they all just fall apart. Everything just doesn't make any sense once you get down to that level. Not the laws of thermodynamics, nothing. It's just like, what? Everything just like popped out of this infinitely small point. And I've also heard it called not the Big Bang. It should be called the great, like the big bloom, like, because all these quantities and constants came out in like exactly these really fine ways that ended up allowing for life. And there's arguments about some of that stuff, obviously. But my thing is, I've looked at that from a Latter-day Saint perspective that says, well, God is, matter is eternal. God is, material, and he's within the universe. And now all of a sudden I'm seeing actually materiality itself, as I experience it, has emerged from this point. And scientifically, that's very, very hard to dispute that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so if all materiality itself emerged from that point, how can I say that there's an eternal material God who existed forever that organized all the matter? And I'm going to let you kind of, if someone brings that up, how would you kind of address it? And then I'll give some of my perspective on how I think about it.
Yeah, it's a tricky point, I think, for Latter-day Saints. In internet discussions particularly, it's generally it's not a mistake, but it can be fatal in many ways, right? To admit, like, oh, that's tricky. I don't know, but keep in mind we have a framework, right? I'm not a Latter-day Saint because I picked one particular point and I feel like we have the best answer to that point, and so that convinced me, right? We take all these data points and we pick what we think best accounts for everything, right? And so I think this happens to be one of the data points that there's not a good answer, particularly. Like obviously it's logically possible that there just wasn't a Big Bang, right? And it's just the data looks like that. The universe is expanding, right? That's a fact. But maybe it was expanding from a certain point that wasn't a singular point, and whatever. We can speculate, all day long. The scientific data is there in terms of the universe expanding, and it looks like it expanded from a certain point, and there's more reason to think there's a Big Bang. But when obviously the scientific data won't account for the possibility of a God intervening, and I'm happy to say, somehow that's compatible with what I believe. I could give all sorts of hypotheses about how God intervened. I'm not terribly bothered about the particulars. And I'm sure you can have even more creative answers about multiverses and that sort of thing, right? And maybe that looks kind of like a fun way of thinking about how we inherit, kingdoms of glory in the future, that sort of thing. So there's more or less detailed answers you can give.
And there are ways to kind of address that. The multiverse one that you bring up is an interesting one. So this is the idea that our universe that we experience, let's call it a local universe, I think is the term that Blake Ostler uses. It is a universe unto itself, but then it emerged from another universe, which is a contemporary theory in scientific, because the scientists also are, the atheistic monist types, they're trying to figure this out as well. And they're saying, well, there might be multiple universes, and that they come because of these quantum fields. And so the idea is that basically we just have a window that's too small for, being able to see the whole picture here. And right. I think that to some extent, that sort of theory, within the idea that there's a sort of spiritual matter that's more refined, that from that, because if we argue that, spiritual matter is more fundamental than, there's a spiritual creation before there was a physical creation, that it does play into the idea that I think you can find ways to approach the Big Bang in which you say spiritual matter gave birth to, physical matter. I personally have certain ideas about quantum field theory specifically, with the idea that these quantum fields, which are, I guess could you not say that they're a more refined matter? They're these fluctuations in energy fields or whatever. I don't have the exact science down because I don't know it exactly, but the analogy that they give is this idea of a sea of chaos, a sea of fluctuating random nothingness, essentially, which seems like nothingness, but it's not really. And that from that emerges physical reality, right? And so I don't know, I guess as I've looked at some of this, because I also had kind of I was like, man, maybe I'm going to join William Lane Craig and I'm going to become a classical theist. This seems pretty compelling. But then I've heard other explanations that say, it isn't a slam dunk, but it is an interesting sort of question to ask, because I don't think we can just ignore scientific discoveries that, seem pretty strongly validated without at least coming up with plausible ideas of how do we make this, how do we make sense of this?
Yeah, it's certainly a place to prod the Latter-day Saint view, I think. And there's a couple of places that are, I'm like, yeah, I don't have a great answer, and that's one of them, I think, right? And yeah, like you said, you can come up with consistent views on how it works, that may not be like super grounded in like particularly strong reasons to accept that view, but that's the nature of every worldview. I think that's inevitable, and so we should be okay. We should be happy happy with that.
I think one of the things that I've actually enjoyed about philosophy in particular is the fact that it has shown me that I can really make questionable almost every worldview out there. And so if I feel questions about my own, it's okay. It's
right.
Everybody has to have their theories and their models that they're trying to and nobody's worldview has where it all fits together.
Yeah.
And anyone who says that it does just has not read widely enough.
No, that's right.
Now, so the other thing though is that Joseph Smith's sort of conceptions, right, for any problems that they might cause, which there are things that are challenging, it also creates some incredible answers to other questions that I think personally are the reason that I'm not a classic theist, such as the problem of evil, and suffering. So could we go into that a little bit? I'd like to hear, what is Joseph's conception of the problem of evil, and how does some of this philosophy that we've been talking about kind of help solve that problem in ways that other kind of theological views can't do?
Yeah, so the problem of evil in a basic form is this. You can formulate it as a trilemma, right? So we have the statement God is omnipotent, we have the statement God is omnibenevolent, and then we have the statement there is evil. And so the idea is, and this is a very ancient argument, if God is omnipotent, that means he can do anything he wants to do. If he's omnibenevolent, that means he wants to, you could put it in a way that shows the tension very clearly by saying he wants to get rid of all evil, or you could, he wants what's best for everyone. And then there is evil. So it looks like if he can do whatever he wants to do and he wants to get rid of evil, then there should be no evil, right? So it looks like we would have to deny one of these. Either he wants to get rid of all evil, but he can't. So he's not omnipotent, or he's omnipotent, but he doesn't want to get rid of all evil, or he's omnipotent and omnibenevolent, and there's no evil, right? And regardless of which one you give up, it looks like you're giving up a standard view of God, right? Certainly like a classical Christian view. And so, so the question is, for each conception of God, is this a problem for you? And if so, how do you solve it? And so, there have been dozens, if not hundreds, of formulations of this argument and answers to the problem. And so, what resources does the Latter-day Saint picture provide in addressing this problem? Well, I think one, so David Paulson, Joseph Smith himself didn't write, as far as I know, anything explicitly kind of as approaching this as like a philosophical topic. But the kind of intuitive notion has always been there, right? Forever. You can talk about the kind of like the pastoral problem of evil, like why are bad things happening? Why would God allow, my family member to die of cancer or something of that nature, right? That's something that people feel and have felt all the time, right? So, what resources do we have as members of the church? Well, so David Paulson is the one that's written about this in kind of Joseph Smith's thought, and he's had some really interesting ideas. So one attempted solution to the problem of evil kind of can involve this idea of universalism, right? So everyone ends up going to heaven. So maybe that can make up for a lot of the evils that we experience in this life. We go to heaven and we get this infinite joy, and maybe that can kind of justify some of the evils. And so there are some problems, there are some tensions. So David Paulson criticized this view of John Hick, who was a universalist, where he says, well, how can we say that we're really free if in the end we all are almost forced to be with God, right? Are you really free if you can't choose not to go to heaven? And so one of the nice things, for instance, about our view is, well, we're functionally universalists in that everyone has the opportunity to go to heaven. But, if you are fully informed, you know exactly what you're doing, but you don't want to be with God, okay, you know, we have outer darkness, right? We have perdition for that. So, you know, so maybe we can be universalists that still maintain a more robust view of free will. That's kind of a nice feature. There's also, I think, the pre-existence, which is fairly unique in our view. Certainly amongst ordinary Christians, there's no conception of a pre-existence. You know, you can imagine if we designed maybe we have we develop an artificial intelligence that can experience pain, right? And so we impose excruciating pain on this artificial intelligence as soon as it comes into existence, in order to, you know, because we have to, in order to get it to immense pleasure afterwards. I think rightly you'd say, well, that seems immoral. But if you create an artificial intelligence and say, hey, I'm going to have to do this, put you through excruciating pain in order to, you know, eventually get you this enormous pleasure, joy. You know, I'm going to tell you as much as I can about it. Do you consent to it? Right? It looks at least plausibly less immoral, right? I think it's much. You can make a much stronger case for that being an okay thing to do, because maybe it can refuse, and you say, okay, well then you just don't get the pleasure side, right? And so a pre-existence can kind of, that's, I think, a very strong resource for saying, well, we all agreed to be here. We knew what was going to happen, and we all agreed to be here, right? So that's another resource we have available to us, right? And then I think perhaps the biggest is that we are much more comfortable with limiting God. I mean, and maybe a lot of members wouldn't be comfortable with that language, but we don't have this really, really maximal absolute view of God, where God is outside of space and time and totally immutable, can't change at all, right? And he can bring matter into existence, all this stuff, right? Like certainly at a bare minimum, we don't think God can create matter from nothing, right? So we've got this enormous limit on God, and so it's much easier to say things like, well, maybe there are things God can't prevent, right? There are evils in the world that, you know, whether that be for the achievement of certain ends, right? Like he wants us to be like him. Well, what is it to be like God? Maybe in part it's to be in possession of certain virtues, but they wouldn't be virtues if you just kind of put them in us, right? It wouldn't be the same thing as temperance if you don't develop it through, you know, being tempted and having this kind of pushback from the world, right? And so it's not in God's power to just put these, to make us like him with a snap of a finger, right? In order to have what counts as these virtues, we have to develop them through facing evils, right? And so, so it's much easier to give that answer, I think, where you don't have this super absolute God.
And that is very much sort of the message of 2 Nephi 2. It's sort of this idea that it's necessary for us to have this. And this is, I think, one of the most fascinating things about Joseph's theology, and it comes from the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
And sort of this idea of Alma 48, where it talks about this idea of God and eternal law, as though God must abide the eternal law.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, wait a minute, what? I thought God makes the eternal law. This is a totally different idea. And when you do that, all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, if reality itself, as I like to, this kind of the words I use, if God exists within reality, he's not the one who made reality out of nothing, right? Well, wait a minute, that changes the whole game. Now he is trying to save us from reality. He's trying to save us from driving off a cliff because through our own stupid behavior, so that we can have the life that he has. And so all of a sudden, I mean, there's a whole lot of implications to this, but for me, within sort of the problem of evil, again, it is when you actually place God in this limited capacity, all of it starts to make sense, because if he created everything out of nothing, and he could have created it however he wanted because he's all powerful, well, why did he make it like this? I've often looked at and I've said, so wait, he made a world, and he could have made it any way he wanted, and he made it in a way that we all suffer, and a world where he had to send his son to die to stop us from being punished by him. Like there's just all sorts of problems with that. We're actually having this more limited view of God is like, wait a minute, all those problems go away. And it's just, as far as I can tell, at least in my own experience, it's just sort of tradition of men. It's just that people have always thought that, oh, well, God has to have created everything out of nothing, and God just, you know, he has to be all powerful in this sense. Otherwise, you know, why call him God or whatever? And it's like, no, we don't have to embrace that tradition. There are other ways to think about this that actually resolve a lot of these problems.
Right. And, you know, of course, this isn't to say that that classical Christians don't have attempted solutions to these problems, right, and all sorts of nuanced ways of addressing the problems. But I think many people are right to find a lot of those solutions unconvincing, and I think you're right in pointing out that one of the really nice things about this view that Joseph Smith kind of starts and that is still in the church today is that it is so much easier to answer a lot of these questions once you're willing to have this picture of God, where God is in this universe. We could say he's struggling against chaos, right? The analogy I like to use is we're in this river and we just are there by nature, right? It's not like God is forcing us into it. And he wants to pull us out of the river before the waterfall at the end, right? That's the natural end of it, right? And that's not the classical theist view where it's like, oh, well, God sends you there, right? He pushes you off the waterfall,
and
right?
he made the waterfall. He could have made it a water park, but he made a waterfall.
Yeah, exactly. And for us, I think it's quite natural to say, well, this is just the nature of the universe. The waterfall's there, right? And God has this rope, and he wants to pull us out, and he can't do it unless we grab onto the rope, because the nature of this justification, exaltation, salvation, whatever you want to call it, is such that we have to do it ourselves in part. And again, this gets complicated with grace and works and that sort of thing. We don't exalt ourselves, but there has to be. I think it looks like there has to be some sort of participation, right? So God, all he has is this rope. He's limited in this way, and so once you say that, right, it's just much easier to address this problem. It's not a solution just to say this by itself, right? Blake Costa has a great book published very recently on the problem of evil, where he goes into kind of some of the fine details and the technical side of this, but a big picture, right, without getting into the technical side of it. It's much easier to approach this problem once you have this picture of God in this universe alongside us, right?
So, and I recently had a conversation with some evangelical friends about sort of these ideas of the limits on God. And a lot of people kind of think, well, you can't place any limits on God. But the problem is that actually, philosophically, if you look at it, there already are limits placed on God in Christianity generally. For instance, C.S. Lewis is, I like to use him as kind of the good middle of the road, mere Christian who everyone kind of is like, yeah, we all like C.S. Lewis. And he's the one who says God can't do nonsense. Mm-hmm. As soon as you say God can't do X, you've limited it in some way. And so, if you're going to say God can't make 2 + 2 = 5 or make a married bachelor, like, you've limited God. And the thing is it's just a question. It isn't a question of have we limited God? It's how much. Because if you're not going to limit God, if you're going to totally unlimit his power, well, then why is any of this happening? Why aren't we all just immediately given heaven? And it's like a sick, weird experiment that we're doing, when it could just be like, okay, well, we don't have free will. You don't have any of that. It's kind of like Satan's plan in our theology. It's just like, we all are in heaven and everyone's happy, and that's just the way it is. Mm-hmm. And it's funny though, but it is actually the limits that you place on God that actually make sense of all of this. And so I think, at least for me, that was what helped me sort of get over this sort of gut fear of ever placing any sort of limits on God. I think you got to be careful about it. I think
sure.
And I will argue against certain LDS views that limit God, I think, way too much. Mm-hmm. Kind of the Brigham Young, Widstow sort of, basically he's a great scientist, and it's mm-hmm. like I'm not a transhumanist. Like, I think it's going a little too far.
Right.
But at the same time, I think that making God totally unlimited just is not feasible.
Yeah, I mean, so there have been a couple of, I only know of two, Descartes and Martin Luther, who've wanted to say, yeah, God can violate laws of logic. He can make 2 + 2 = 5. And I think that's a totally nonsense, because I don't think we can. How can we ever say anything about God? It could be that he's omnipotent. Maybe he's omnipotent and not omnipotent. Right? We have no idea. How can we make any statement? So I'm comfortable being fairly dismissive of that view. And then you're right. As soon as you say, and there are ways people try to say, well, it's not really a limit, but I'm really not convinced by that. I think you're right. As soon as you say God is bound by logical laws, or someone like William Lane Craig wants to say there are even metaphysical constraints. God can't create an actual infinite, and that's not a logical constraint. That's now a metaphysical constraint, because actual infinites are logically consistent, right? So I think people don't realize that it's not super strange and unusual to say God's omnipotent, but what that means is he can do whatever it's possible to do, and not just he can do anything except for logical impossibilities, right? It's very natural. It happens all the time. Christians all the time limit God in various ways, such that he's still omnipotent, but we just have maybe a slightly smaller circle for what is possible to do.
Yep, exactly. So as kind of our last topic here, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the mind-body problem, and specifically how the LDS worldview and kind of Joseph's philosophy, how maybe it's a little bit better to equipped to deal with that issue when compared to kind of the traditional theistic view.
So the mind-body problem, the basic notion is, if you have this dualistic picture, let's just take a very simple dualistic picture. There are more complex ones, of course, but this kind of Cartesian, simplistic dualistic picture where we have matter, this physical stuff, and then you have this mind stuff. How is it that they're interacting at all, right? So maybe you have a center of intelligence, of consciousness, that makes decisions, say. So let's say right now I decide to raise my arm, and I can do that. From the mental side to the physical side, what is going on, right? So we know on the physical side there's this kind of brain stuff that goes on that precedes my raising my arm. Okay, great. And so where does the mind come in, right? If you have this dualistic picture, what's where is it touching the mind, right? I mean, and so it's always hard.
Physicality. We know the laws that govern that,
right?
And so it's like, well, wait a minute, where does mind even come into this picture?
Yeah, there's kind of the problem of like, the kind of how do we fit it into like a scientific picture, but even just conceptually, right? It's if you try to think about something immaterial moving, affecting a physical thing, it's conceptually very difficult. And this is noticed very early on, right? There's Descartes in his letters is faced with this problem, right? There's Anne Conway, a contemporary of Descartes, has this really nice metaphor where she says it's like you're saying there's wind moving through a sail that's a net, right? How is that making it move, right? And so that's the kind of the basic problem is how do you get this interaction, right? So you have people like Leibniz who say something like they're just kind of coordinated. God makes sure they're always moving at the same time. So you feel like your mind is causing your body to move, but maybe it's just your mind does that and the body does that because God ordains both, right? And so, yeah, there's a conceptual difficulty that's really tricky to think.
And the idea being is, just to sum it up, it's the idea of, okay, you have mind, you have body, but where do they touch?
Right, like, because they're not meant to have anything in common, right? Yeah, they're meant to be different
totally
substances.
Separate realms.
Yeah, right.
Because if it did touch it, that would put it in the realm of physicality.
Yeah.
And it's like math. I know that I've heard people use math as sort of a concept of like mind, like it exists, right? It exists. But the idea here is like, but how does math cause me to do stuff? It isn't math that causes me to do stuff. That's just a concept that's in my head. Mm-hmm. It may be in however we want to talk about that, but math doesn't make my car go. You know what I mean? It's like,
yeah.
It's
there's the famous Paul Ben-Asaraf problem for Platonism and mathematics. This idea of like how are we right about math if they're these like abstract objects that are non-causal? Yeah. So yeah, I think you're right. It's a similar problem. And so yeah, so how do we approach this? So for dualists, there might be different ways that you can try to approach that problem, like Leibniz did, right, where he says they're just kind of coordinated, and then you could just say, well, that's too big a problem. We should just be monists, right? And I think that's kind of the direction that certainly like Orson Pratt went. He was really dismissive of this of immaterialism. So it makes absolutely no sense to talk about it like an immaterial substance. He says it's just nonsense.
Yeah, that's I want to hit that because you kind of hit that kind of fast, but I want to like hammer it down because I thought it was one of the most brilliant things I've heard. And I was like, wait, he says immaterial substance, which is found in the creeds. Mm-hmm. Is a contradiction in terms. It's like saying a married bachelor. It just doesn't make sense. You can't have a substance that's immaterial. Those two words don't seem to work together. At least that's my initial impression of it. I mean,
there are sophisticated contemporary philosophical dualists and that sort of thing. But there's definitely something intuitively very appealing about. So it's actually Orson Pratt has quite a robust. He's got this like modal epistemology where what's conceivable is what's possible, and something that's inconceivable is impossible. And so he's got this quite rigorous view, and he has this quite a good, it's an interesting argument where he says it's inconceivable that there be, that God be without parts, or that there be substance that has no extensional location. It's inconceivable, and therefore it's impossible. It's like a reversal of Descartes' conceivability of the mind being separate from the body. Therefore, there is mind separate from body. It's a really interesting piece of philosophy. And so yeah, he says it's just flatly we can't conceive of an immaterial substance. And I think I think there's something very powerful about that. I think
Yeah,
you can feel the pull of that. I think if you think about it, right? If you kind of
I
think about
definitely
what that would mean for there to be an immaterial substance.
I definitely can, and one of the ways that I've heard it expressed is sort of this idea of, well, if something, you know, if something can be an idea or it can be real, and that's sort of, ideas are just ideas. So if you're saying that God is immaterial, so God is just an idea, it's like, well, I guess no one can dispute that. He is an idea. Like, but our thing is no, he isn't just an idea, right? And to transition from the idea of God to God, there has to be sort of this transition across the plane of materiality, where the mind body sort of divide just doesn't seem to have any room to cross it, at least from kind of a gut level. Me as someone who's not a trained philosopher here, but who looks at that, I just can't quite wrap my head around it. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
I know for my mother, for instance, one of the big things was sort of, that was one of the doctrines when she joined the church. My mom's a convert, that really helped her. She was like, this makes sense. What I was taught my whole life was, they were talking about 3-in-1 and immaterial substances and, hypostatic union and all that kind of stuff. And it all just seemed like a lot of mental gymnastics, where it was just like, no, he is material, but in a material sense that is far deeper than we right now have any grasp on,
Mm-hmm.
And I think quantum physics, if anything, has shown us that what we once thought we knew about materiality, we don't understand material. That's
Yeah.
kind of my question. And that's an interesting later physics development after the time of Joseph Smith, that basically said, philosophically, you'd say, well, maybe there's more to material than meets the eye. And then, in Joseph's day, everyone would have laughed at you. You know what I mean? And now it's like, no, there's a lot more to material than we realize.
Yeah, to say that the world is made up of fields, right, as opposed to like particles, but like these kind of areas of influence. That's a very popular view in science, and yeah,
And we
certainly
have
not
no
the
idea
way
what the
people
heck
have thought
those
about
fields
matter.
are.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
like
right.
we're trying to, we have models that we use to kind of try to describe them, but like, those are just words we're using to describe them. Like, you might describe it as a substance that's more refined that you can't see, from which all material reality emerges. You know what I mean? That's obviously, I have kind of my own theories about that. I could be totally wrong. I've been wrong on many things. So, well, anyway, as we kind of wrap this up, I know it's getting late for you. Any final thoughts as Latter-day Saints approach these topics, as they look into Joseph's theology? Any final thoughts or things that you think that they should keep in mind as they go through doing this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, philosophy is fun. That's one thing I would say keep in mind. This needn't be something that we find to be this like horrible drag. There's so much that's rich in philosophy, and there's so much that's rich in philosophy in the church. Find something that's fun as well as interesting and productive and useful, right? But yeah, I mean, I would also, I think, say, yeah, try to read philosophy that's not just in the church. It's really helpful to have a kind of bigger picture and see how it fits in. And I do really want people to read more philosophy in the church. There is a lot here. It's really cool stuff. And we have a really powerful worldview, or we have the resources for a really powerful worldview. And that's not known in or outside the church. And I would love for it to be more known. I think members are missing out by not taking advantage of being able to kind of be aware of the fact that we have really powerful answers to really long-standing questions. Right? We have the resources to be able to say things that no one else can say in answer to these questions, and that's a good feeling, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. And with that, you're talking about these resources. If you could name a few books that you really think Latter-day Saints should read, if you're a thoughtful Latter-day Saint, what are some of those books that you'd recommend?
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of good kind of historical scholarship on Latter-day Saint philosophy. In fact, there's next to none. So there's primary sources, right? People like Orson Pratt in like his series of pamphlets, The Seer. There's a Signature Books has a kind of collection of his essays. They have a collection for B.H. Roberts as well. Roberts is really good. The Truth, the Way, the Life. But really, the person to go to for the time being is Blake Ostler, right? So he's got some historical stuff in his 3-volume, now 4-volume set, Exploring Modern Thought, right? So he lays out his own views, and so, many of them will be controversial, many of them are not really in the history of our thought. Like open theism is pretty new with Blake. But that's, if you want to get into philosophy, it's a little bit it's a little bit technical at times, but they're really worth reading. That's I think as good a place to start as we have at the moment.
Absolutely.
When it comes to philosophy, aside from reading Joseph Smith and Orson Pratt and B.H. Roberts and all that.
In addition to that, I would point people to their podcast, the Exploring Mormon Thought podcast, where I think it's better because it's in the book. It does get real technical. It's serious stuff, man.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but in his podcast, it's a little bit more your average person can probably.
No, you're right. It's much more accessible. Yeah, that's a very good point. That is probably a better place to start actually than the books. Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, hey, you're a new resource as well for all of them. So tell us all if they want to get in touch with you again, let's go through where they can do that.
Yeah, so I've got a YouTube channel. I've got a Twitter account where anyone feel free to reach out, tweet at me, LDS Philosophy, or DM, and then I've got an email account, ldsphilosophy@gmail.com. I'm honestly really happy to answer questions and have conversations, and I love hearing people's ideas about doctrines and philosophy and talking about it, or recommending more particular resources in particular areas. I'm really happy to help on this stuff. I just want to do what I can to help encourage more philosophical discourse in the church, because there's so much cool stuff here.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much, Joseph, for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, take care. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, if you want more content, including the podcast, go to thoughtful-faith.com. Thanks for watching.